Dungeon 42. By S. Jackson. Chapter 165. The Rusty Daggers. Signboards were fairly common, but the ability to read the listings wasn't. Jared paid a girl a coin to read to him, ignoring when Darren of the Red Sun Company arrived to snatch up the adverts he favored. "Ass," Jared muttered at the man's retreating back. The girl giggled and rolled her eyes. She was little, but dressed a bit better than most peasant children, her ability to read likely helping her family make ends meet better than most. "What's the one he took say?" Jared asked. Darren was a lot of things, most of them insufferably pretentious, but stupid wasn't on the list. He'd pick good jobs. "Dunno, but I've another," the girl said, reaching to a box behind the board. She withdrew another bit of paper. It had the same fancy squiggles around the edge as the other. "Looking for adventurers. Possible dungeon near town in Mountain Valley. Treasure possible, danger certain, local guild looking for members to investigate." "What guild?" Jared asked, finding that confusing. Guilds always had money, even in small villages, but that wouldn't necessarily make it profitable. He liked a decent upfront fee rather than relying solely on salvage. He didn't understand why weavers, tanners, or whatever would want members to look into it. "The Adventurers Guild," the girl replied. "The what?" Jared asked. The girl turned the paper over, revealing more on the back odds since none of the ink had bled through. "Laurel Mountain Adventures Guild, now recruiting. Low boarding fees, training opportunities, butchering services, and more," the girl read. There was a drawing of a map on the backside along with that information. It wasn't the best he'd ever seen, but more than sensible enough to make finding the place relatively simple. "Thanks," Jared said, handing the girl a copper. He'd paid her fee, but it never hurt to keep in the good graces of someone literate. Gods knew none of the rest of his group were. The lot of them were like him, slum kids and second sons of sharecroppers, the Rusty Dagger Lads, as they called themselves. The name was mostly a joke. They didn't have fine enough manners or good enough equipment to take jobs from better paying sources that cared about things like that. Their roster also shifted in the wind. Everyone came and went as they pleased, Jared always on the hunt for talent to keep them at a size able to make decent money. The Red Sun Company wasn't like that. They had fancy names and could make deals with even fancier people. Something they never hesitated to rub in everyone else's faces. Still, Jared wasn't one to poach a job usually, but this one would be an exception. Unlike a regular job, a dungeon didn't follow any rules. You went if you had the guts and returned if you were lucky. As many as wanted could try them out, rather than having to get the approval of the person posting a job. More importantly, though he'd never faced off against one himself, dungeons were said to yield profits even for those who only explored them shallowly. Last stop, the post town where his group had decided to rest for the night, was small. Jared returned from the signboard to the inn in just a few minutes. The rest of the Rusty Daggers sat down to the cheapest dinner the establishment offered, a stew with most of the solid bits already scooped out to better paying customers. It did come with bread, though, and wasn't the worst thing any of them had ever paid to eat. "I found us a job," Jared announced as he sat at the table. He signaled for an ale, not bothering to take in the less than excited gazes of his group. Things had been trying lately, little in the way of decent jobs with mercenary work on the rise. Honest enough, but not the best paying option and more dangerous than it was worth unless you knew what you were about. "Here or elsewhere?" Cord asked, clearly only caring if they'd need to travel further. The man was heavily built, and travel was harder on him than the others. "Elsewhere, but we'll take a day's rest first," Jared offered. That got him the group's attention. They usually were quick on the take when it came to making money. Things having been rough lately, they likely expected him to be impatient, and he would have been with other work. There was a posting for an adventurers guild that's recruiting about 2 days' travel into the mountains from here. Say they've got a dungeon somewhere abouts and want people to try their hand at it, Jared explained. Information he'd have played closer to the vest if it weren't for the box of postings the girl had fished the one he had from. There was little chance of it not having spread quite a ways from the post town, let alone within it. Whispering about common knowledge would end with them looking like fools or suspicious, and he wasn't interested in either thing. "Boss, that seems like a bad idea," Quint said softly. He wasn't exactly a coward, but edging from cautious toward it far more than the rest of the daggers. He could also do a bit of magic, so nobody bothered him about it. "Possibly, but let's have a look, then make up our minds. We'll be there to make money, not put our necks on the line," and if we don't all agree, we split ways if needed, Jared offered. It was the standard arrangement among them. Nobody had to stay on for a job they didn't like, whatever the reason. Not a common way of doing things, but one that had kept the group fairly harmonious over the years. Gods be good, why even bother? A braying voice asked before cracking into laughter. Darren of the Red Sun was standing with a bottle of wine in hand and a woman on his arm. Jared looked the lady over but didn't see any signs that she was a working girl and his lips twisted a bit. He could understand someone fucking the man for coin, but the idea of anyone with sense finding him attractive seemed a bit unlikely. Fuck off, none of your business, Jared said simply without heat. He disliked Darren but it wasn't as if they normally had much to do with each other than the passing glare. They worked in the same territory, but it wasn't as if they took jobs from the same places or ever worked together. Really, Jared would have been entirely indifferent to the other man's existence if he weren't such a fucking ass. He'd gone so far as to try and hire the Rusty Dagger as porters once, just to insult them. The worst part was that Jared would have taken the work if he'd have offered fair wages, but he hadn't, insisting that working for the Red Suns was honor enough to make up the difference. That was an offense too far. I should think it is, since it's my band that will rid the valley of that scourge. They won't need a bunch of money-grubbing parasites like you about, and I'd rather not deal with the smell, Darren replied. Cord started to rise, hand on his blade, but Jared stopped him with a shove on the shoulder. Go fuck your lady friend while she's still willing, lest that rot you call a personality put her off, Jared countered. He wasn't scared of scrapping with the man, particularly since he wasn't wearing any of his shiny armor, but the daggers had paid for a room. If the innkeeper took offense, they'd be cast out and the coin lost, and he didn't fancy sleeping in the scrubland around the town. Worthless Darren's retort was lost at a tug on his sleeve from the lady. It seemed she wasn't interested in the squabble either and a bit embarrassed by Jared's blatant words. He felt a little bad about that. He didn't grudge the woman her pleasures even if he might not think kind of where she sought them. Once Darren and his companion were gone, Jared gulped down the last of his ale and slammed his tankard onto the table with a thud. Think they've got the guts to face the dungeon, or will they go scurrying home after sampling village life? Pip, the party's rogue, asked mockingly. The others laughed. Sleepin' rough will probably be enough to send them packing, Cord said with a snort. We ought to teach those dandies a lesson tomorrow, Pip continued, eyes glinting dangerously. Maybe if a few of their silks get torn, they'll think twice about speaking to us. No trouble here, it's a post town and that means we're still under the Earl's law, Jared reminded them. Murmurs of agreement rose from around the table. Savix was brutal, and if they did anything untoward it would come out of their hides. Rest, we have a bit of a trip ahead of us, he added. He watched the rest of the group get up and go, heading to their shared room. For his own part, he ordered a sad bowl of stew and continued contemplating the choice he'd made. Stories were one thing, he hoped that the riches a dungeon offered even the cautious were even a tenth of what was spoken of. They needed money, but dead men couldn't spend coin. Chapter 166. Oddities. Jared surveyed the town laid out below them with a critical eye. Tucked in a valley of the Laurel Mountains appeared prosperous enough at first glance. The buildings lining the cobblestone streets were well maintained, painted in neat colors with tile rooftops gleaming in the sun. Villagers went about their business. The layout was strange, orderly in a way Jared wasn't accustomed to seeing. Pretty even, and it lacked a certain raw newness of a boomtown. He'd never been near a dungeon, but he'd happened upon a town built around processing an old dragon's corpse when it had been found dead out in the hinterlands when he was young. This place had been around a while, and despite the notice asking for adventures, nobody seemed to be particularly scared. He supposed that might change come sundown though. Creatures born of a dungeon were said to fear its light. Where's this supposed dungeon then? Cord rumbled, voicing the question on all their minds. From their vantage, no dark stronghold or other ominous sign marred the charming landscape. Fuck if I know. Let's see about the guild first, then worry we've been lied to, Jared said with a shrug. As they headed down, it wasn't long before they started running into folks who were happy enough to direct them toward their destination. Once they reached the town proper, it got easier. The streets had signposts which included symbols, a grey pair of cross swords being the one for the guild. They also found themselves the subject of curious questions and a not inconsiderable amount of food giving. Bringing up the guild seemed to be like a magic word that caused people to smile and offer them whatever they had on hand. No matter if it was a fresh meat pie, a bit of vegetables, some really delightful cheese, everyone seemed to want to give them something. It probably would have been off-putting if Jared hadn't tried to be polite and tasted the first meat pie he was offered. He was hungry and he didn't care if it were burnt or something. It was nice to be offered cast-offs rather than them going to the pigs or something. Food was food, and when he bit into the juicy and genuinely meat-filled crust he sort of lost track of things and started eating until he was almost sickeningly full. They all had, and anything they couldn't cram down was quickly squirreled away in their packs for later. "I think it was worth coming here just for that," Pip said, doing what little he could to stifle a truly indulgent belch. It was still probably heard halfway to the town gate. "Agreed," Quint enthused. They'd found their way to a green and were laying about on the grass, enjoying life for a few minutes. "Just me, or are there a lot of folk with fucked up ears here?" Cord asked, pausing between bites of the turnip he was going at like it was an apple. "Cord, fuck off, they might be a little fey," Quint said, low and urgent. It wasn't common for fey to join blood with mortals, but when they did, it showed. The thin pointed ear folk were almost uncomfortably pretty and a few were odd colors, so it was entirely possible. "What he said," Jared agreed. "They're elves," a low, quiet voice offered. Quint gave a start, turning to look up who'd spoke. He didn't have to crane his neck much to meet eyes with the little fella, only about the size of a taller child. Beyond his size he didn't look a bit like one, even discounting the tail and larger ears. He had earther skin and bright white hair with the oddest vibrant orange eyes Jared had ever seen. As if someone had placed jewels in them for color. "They're what?" Cord asked, dumbfounded. "Elves, it's what they call themselves, and most of them aren't fey," the little fellow explained. "For my part, I'm Realis Old Buck Humorous, at your service. Pleasure to meet you. I'm Jared, this is Cord, Quint, Pip," Jared said, offering his hand on reflex at the introduction. Argent should have been with them, but if there was one thing the man was good for, it was randomly fucking off without saying a thing. "Something we can do for you?" Jared asked, sitting up. The others followed suit. "The opposite actually, I work for the guild and word got round there were adventurers looking for us. If you'll follow me, I'd be happy to get you settled in and answer any of your questions about the guild," Realis said. "Settled?" Pip asked. "Into the dormitory, if you'd like. We offer a few weeks' stay as a courtesy while people get themselves settled in. I'll also explain the work opportunities and the situation with the dungeon," Realis clarified. "Courtesy? You mean free?" Jared asked, not believing that for a minute. "For a maximum of 2 weeks. Lodging comes with meals and use of the baths, which I encourage as you might meet the guild master if she has time. Dawn makes a point of meeting newcomers," Realis explained. Jared just nodded at that, getting to his feet, which the others took as a sign to do the same. "A lady's in charge?" Cord asked, openly surprised. "Indeed, the mayor is also a woman. You'll find them in a great deal of positions of authority here," Realis said with a chuckle. Jared belted Cord one openly in the kidney for being stupid. "Ain't like they aren't outside of it too," Jared said, trying to smooth things over. Realis nodded at that, apparently unbothered. The halfling man led them on to a rather grand-looking building, and right past it to a more modest 2-story one. The man at the desk looked up curiously, red eyes startlingly vivid. "Cabinla? What you do to end up on desk?" Rollis asked the man with a bit of a grin. "Gave Yagna a bit more of a kick and than I should have," Cabinla said with a shrug. Glancing at the rest of them he fetched keys and offered them to the group. "Baths are that way, your rooms are all next to each other on the 2nd floor, privy is at the end of the hall. If you want to use the washing service, it's a copper for an evenly filled basket we provide here at the desk," Cabinla explained. "I should probably dump my pack into one," Quint said with a sigh. He was wearing his cleanest set, and it wasn't clean by any stretch of the imagination. Cabinla lifted up a basket and gestured. Quint hesitated, but it was fairly large and it was a fair price, he took it finally. "Bring it back when you're done getting settled. And feel free to put the pack in if it fits, they'll do it too," Cabinla explained. "I'll take one too," Jared said. Pip followed suit, only Cord not taking the offer just then. Jared made a note to ask him how low he was on coin later when they were alone. He didn't want to assume or embarrass the other man. Some additional fees and services were discussed, but it was all pretty standard and nothing was unusually expensive. "I do suggest using the baths before you bed down, feels nice," Cabinla offered in parting. "Gentlemen, there's a bar in the guild hall that serves food. Join me there whenever you feel like it and we'll talk more," Rollis said, staying behind with Cabinla. It was strange to be offered separate rooms, but going by the doors, they weren't all that big. Stepping into his own, Jared was still impressed, the space comfortable and not cramped despite its size. Accustomed to splitting one about twice the size with everyone, it was downright luxurious. Throwing everything washable, including his pack, into the laundry basket, he set aside his last decent change of clothes. As the leader, he always made a point of reserving at least one clean set in case he had to talk to someone about work. Using the basin to wash up, he felt halfway alive and looked a sight better in the copper mirror hanging behind it than he had coming into the valley. Probably not decent enough to meet the guild master, but good enough to take dinner and not make a foul impression. He was halfway out of his door when he heard a horrid screech noise from the end of the hall. A moment later turned just in time to see Cord burst from behind the door, pants around his ankles, before he slammed down face first. "The fuck?" Pip asked. Jared just nodded, that was his question too. Chapter 167. Discussions. After finding out the privy was magic and squirted water up your backside, things did not get less weird for Jared and the rusty daggers. Rather than having recently been discovered, it seemed the town had existed alongside the dungeon since its founding, which was an event well beyond living memory. The situation presented dangers, but a robust town guard and several gates at choke points between its entrance and anything important kept things peaceful enough. The call for adventurers had been motivated not by dire need, but an interest in taking advantage of the situation and pulling out what treasure and resources they could from it. Jared found he liked the odd mixture of pragmatism and frankly unmatched stones the locals seemed to have in coming up with that kind of plan. Most people would have likely taken off running after hearing a dungeon was nearby, and rightly so. The baths were magic too, and in a very welcomed way in that they remained clean despite all of the daggers aside from Argent descending to use them at once. Baths weren't normally free since someone had to heat and haul the water to the tub, but the guild's magic one didn't require those labors. They also emphasized that one should bathe frequently, daily even. Jared found that strange, but given how there were both a warm and cool option, he could see it being pleasant in any season. Everyone dined that evening in the guild hall without incident, Realis putting in an appearance to explain a few more things to them. When none of them proved able to read the contracts, he'd asked if they'd want to learn, and Quint had jumped at the chance. He knew a few letters but hadn't ever really learned. More importantly, Realis explained how the guild jobs worked. Those who joined got access to a posting board, which they did thankfully have a reader for, and could take them according to their ranking. New members started at copper rank unless they passed a skills test at the training grounds. Jared had expected the pay to be bad for new members, but it looked fair for the work. The guild fees also weren't high, particularly since they came with free meals at the guild hall, though drinks outside of a first mug of ale were excluded. Nobody would starve trying to make their dues, and so long as you weren't a layabout, money was to be made. "So, free lodgings here for 2 weeks, then we start paying?" Jared asked Realis. "Afraid not, new folks only, even though we have the room at the moment. Guild policy to avoid people getting touchy about leaving," Realis explained. "Might want to lower it then, I'm already fond of my bed," Cord offered with a chuckle. Realis tipped his drink to that. The mayor and the guild master already worked out a sort of deal on the point. "Town folk who are interested will list rooms for rent with us, and there's an inventory of available buildings. A group like yours could fairly easily rent a place together if you work hard and are careful with your coins," Realis explained. "Let's say we join, what's that ranking assessment require exactly?" Jared asked. "Tests of combat prowess and teamwork. Also general survival skills, recognizing traps, field medicine, avoiding ambushes. Shouldn't pose much difficulty for experienced blades like yourselves," Realis explained matter-of-factly. "You're ranked accordingly, and any shortfalls explained so you can work on them to reach the next up. I'm shite when it comes to survival, and I haven't a team, but..." Realis fished in his shirt and pulled a tag up by a chain. It was glinting and silverish with a gemstone set in it that matched his eyes. "I'm a handy enough bard. Individual and team ranks work a bit differently. Team rankings only really matter for group assignment and the dungeon," he added. "Fair," Jared offered. It would be good to know where an individual stood as well as a group, depending on the work, he supposed. "There's a board over that way that shows our members and their ranks as well as if they're in town or not. Once people get to know you a bit better, you can use it to help you find people to fill in skill gaps," Realis explained. Jared nodded, ignoring the now familiar feeling of confusion. Like most things in the town, the sheer level of organization such a board implied was surprising. "Right then. Well, think things over and decide what we want to do," Jared offered. Rialis simply nodded at that and eventually excused himself to the bar. The halfling drank like he had a hole in his stomach and eventually brought out a mandolin and started playing merrily. Foot traffic also picked up about then and the sparse group of other dinners turned into a much thicker crowd of drinkers. Sight more folk than I thought were here, Jared muttered. Makes sense, they were probably working and don't live close like we do, Quint offered. Jared nodded though it still seemed a little off to him. Others were joining in on the music though and someone bought a round and what concerns he had were quickly forgotten in favor of merriment. Luck being a fair and just being, Jared found himself meeting the guild master the next morning horrifically hungover but clean. The laundry service was frankly remarkable and he'd chosen to bathe at the receptionist's assurance that it and some cold tea would help with the headache. He'd been surprised to find it was true. You look like you tried to keep up with Rollius last night, Dawn offered when she first sat down. I don't know where he put it all, unless he's hollow like a keg on the inside, Jared had grumbled. He'd been rather embarrassed when she finally introduced herself, mostly because he'd fancied trying to ask her for a walk and a tumble. She was funny in a dry way and good-looking but he didn't mess with his employers. That was a quick way to hard feelings and withheld pay. I won't bother you much since you haven't actually joined yet, but if you do I'll be the one appraising you on the dungeon and we have a foraging party planned for the end of the week. If you want in on that, you have 2 days to join and get assessed, Dawn explained. You go in yourself? Jared asked, genuinely surprised. With a fancy title like Guildmaster he'd thought she mostly did paperwork and collected money. I'm qualified and it's my job to make sure we keep the other guilds supplied with materials. There are more skilled adventurers than myself, but they have other roles in the dungeon, Dawn said, drawing out a steel tag with a gold symbol embedded in it. They went copper, brass, iron, steel for the basic ranks. Silver, gold, and Gilner, whatever that was, make up the higher ones. You're not the strongest in the guild? Jared asked, genuinely confused. He'd thought the higher ranks were for show given that qualifying for iron required a heroic class. Few enough people had those, let alone many ranks in them. No, I'm the strongest of those willing to do paperwork and settle pay disputes, Dawn said with a flash of a grin. Ah, so the requirement is mental fortitude, Jared said with a chuckle. They shared a laugh and Dawn was on her way again shortly. Jared spent the rest of the day looking around the town and getting a feel for things. The equipment offerings were normally priced, which was astonishingly low given the quality. Particularly when it came to arms and armor. Why though presented itself in the pitying looks he got from the folks fronting those shops. The best short sword he ever owned didn't even qualify as a failed blade of dwarven make. Existing beside long-lived folks like that, even the human craftsman had picked up a greater skill than he was accustomed to seeing. There also wasn't much of a market for the goods. The town had a small existing population but it had been dwindling as people grew fearful of the dungeon since it was more active of late according to what he was able to gather from the shopkeepers. It was also why they were quite happy to see a group of adventurers come into the town so soon after sending out their notices. Nobody was in trouble, but they weren't exactly doing well with such a small population and no trade yet established. As midday came around Jared returned to rouse the rest of the daggers out of their hangover slump and get them to try the tea fix and a bath. It worked well enough for them too and they all took lunch together in the town. Cord had thankfully put his laundry out the prior night to be done and it was ready by then. His reticence apparently not about coin but rather not having a spare set. His remaining one was a bit threadbare too. All right, this place is different, but we're lucky it is. These people are happy to see us because they need folks to start trading with and the prices are low for the same reason. I vote we stay, join the guild, and get in on the gathering party this week, Jared explained as they took lunch on the green. They'd actually bought their food this time and ate more sparingly as they weren't presently starving. Fine by me, Cord said, as usual. He'd almost always agree to anything that might make them money. I want to stay either way, Rialis is introducing me to the school come the start of the week, Quint said simply. And the rest? Jared asked, staying wasn't the main point. I'll go along with it for now, we hardly know anything yet and we might all be changing our minds, Quint said with a shrug. Jared mirrored it, not able to argue with that. Fine, Pip. Jared asked. What Quint said, Pip replied, which was unusual. The rogue was usually contrary for its own sake when it came to Quint. Jared wasn't about to look a gift horse in the mouth though. I'm in too, came another voice. The group startled as a humanoid figure dropped out of the tree they'd been eating under. Argent, you fucking Cord was already on his feet, trying to give the other man a shove. Scared us, ya bastard, Jared summarized. Oh, sorry. I thought you came over because I was here, Argent replied, as if it were entirely normal for them to check the trees for party members. You've mislaid your pants again, Pip added. Argent was a beast folk with some kind of dog or other such creature ancestry since he had particular features but wasn't a wolf by his own dedication. He wasn't wearing anything but a kilt, putting his ears, tail, and rather heavily furred body openly on display. A display nobody wouldn't appreciated seeing at random in a village even if he was human. I haven't actually, Argent said, pointing up to where most of his other clothes were hanging in the tree. Right, but being in town means you're to wear them and your shirt, remember? Jared asked. Argent wasn't exactly stupid, but certain ideas just never seemed to take in his brain for reasons nobody had ever been able to explain. Jared expected it was simply disinterest combined with his low attention span. Oh, right, sorry. There are other beast folk here too, so I just thought, Argent trailed off, likely not having thought the idea through enough to make an argument. Look, just the shirt is probably fine. I've seen some other people in kilts around, Jared offered. Okay, and like I said, I'm in, Argent replied with a grin. With that he scaled the tree to retrieve his things while everyone else just looked away. He really was only wearing the kilt, the bastard. Chapter 168. In the rear, with the gear. Pip had never in his life felt so miserably stupid. He was a thief by trade, and to his knowledge a pretty good one. Not a rogue certainly, but those were vanishingly rare. He was on the 10th of 15 traps and he'd yet to have a bloody idea what any of them were, let alone how to go about disarming them. A particularly serious failure as he was looking at them with the bare mechanisms revealed rather than hidden. He'd done better in the survival section when it came to what one could eat and how to deal with standard things like deadfalls and snares. This kind of shit is down there? Pip asked no one in particular. It's where we dug it out, yeah, Heather replied. She was his test something or other fancy sounding. She'd spent the majority of the time drawing red X's with a crayon, as she called it, on his score and peeling an apple. Well, then I'm fucked, Pip said without feeling ashamed. He'd been provided tools but didn't know what half of them were even for. The bag of marbles in particular seemed entirely out of place. It's not that big a deal. Turn up for training if you want to learn and just live with being copper in the meantime. It's not like you can't participate in gathering just because of that, Heather offered along with the peeled apple. It was probably a pity-driven offer, but Pip had grown up such that he never turned down food and accepted it. What good would I even be? Pip asked, curious. The last bit is about that, how gathering works and the different roles. You could either run carts to deliver the goods back to the entrance or gather things yourself. Work is work and you'll get your share the same as everyone else, Heather explained, ending with a shrug. That seems oddly fair, Pip admitted. He didn't trust anything that was too fair. Thank the mayor for that. She's an odd one all around, Heather said. Right, haven't seen her though, I keep hearing about her, Pip admitted, curious. She's busy, Heather replied casually. It was something that came up a lot. Everyone seemed to know the mayor, which was normal in a small town, but there was an oddly casual air to it. As if they weren't much interested in what she was doing. He wasn't sure if that meant they trusted her, she was useless so it didn't matter, or something else he couldn't quite put together. Want to save yourself the trouble and just take the fail now? You can't pass at this point anyway, Heather asked. Pip was caught off guard by that but sighed and nodded in the end. His pride was already in tatters and he could better use the time finishing the rest of the assessment and getting a meal at the guild hall. It wasn't long before Pip was back with everyone else. Jared, Cord, and Argent looked like they'd had the shit kicked out of them and Quint was just curled in fetal position looking depressed. It went well, I take it? Pip asked merrily. It lifted his spirits a bit to see that he hadn't been the only one to have a rough time. Fuck off, Jared replied without spurt. They all ranked copper and the follow-up lesson about what roles they could have during the gathering was short. Weirdly Quint didn't ever come out of his haze of misery even when they were back at the guild eating. What all happened to him? He's acting like he got kicked in the head by a horse or something, Pip ventured. Quint had made it through his meal but hadn't even gone for a second ale. Magic test didn't go well. I didn't understand the details, but it seems like he doesn't know any serious magic, just street tricks, Jared offered. So? Pip asked, at a loss. Those street tricks were useful enough for the work the daggers usually did. I don't get it either, he's the most magic person I know, Jared said. Quint didn't stir at them talking about him like he wasn't there despite being at the table. Not a good sign but not something he knew what to do with either. He was more accustomed to and comfortable with needling the other man for being such a know-it-all. We're all still in for the job though, right? Pip asked. He could go alone if needed, but didn't enjoy the idea. The guild seemed fine but he was leery to try something new without people he trusted watching his back. Course, Jared replied immediately. Cord and Argent gave affirmative grunts. With that settled they passed the evening more or less ignoring Quint and heading to bed early. Equipped with a copper tag, Pip gave the notice board a try the next morning and found doing odd jobs around the town basically fine and reasonably well paying. It was also something to distract him while they all waited for the gathering. Coin in his pocket, he managed to afford a new pair of plain daggers that made the best of his old set seem terribly shabby. He sold his worst pair for scrap and the looks he got at the forge suggest they were being charitable in doing so. A better set of leather was right out of the question though. Much too costly but very, very, nice. With something to do, Pip kept busy and collected coin until the morning of the gathering expedition. He wouldn't get rich with copper jobs, but minor comfort was in reach. The crew gathered for the task were laid back, but not unduly. They'd done it a few times before and knew the layout rather than being arrogant. What was less enjoyable was the appearance of the Red Sun Company. Bunch of braggarts seemed to have gotten in the prior evening and washed up at an inn. Darren spouted off like he was wont to do and brushed past everyone getting ready to work at the entrance to the mine like they weren't there. All but Don, who stood in the passage, half a head taller than Darren, who wasn't a short man. "You're going to die if you go like you are," Don said flatly. "Spoken like a small-town talent," Darren replied. Before he could say more, Don simply stepped aside, gesturing graciously for him to continue on. Pip couldn't help a snort at that. Don had heroic class levels, small-town talent was a much more apt description of Darren himself. He was glad to see the high-handed bastard and company march to their doom, but of course, Jared wasn't so sensible. Jared had stopped two of them and was speaking quietly. Two younger men Pip hadn't noticed the last time. Coin exchanged hands and the pair took off for the town. Darren didn't come back looking for them though, so they might as well have taken their time. Don delayed the start of their descent, letting the other group get ahead of them rather than trying to catch up. Nobody protested, not fancying a chance meeting in the dark. "Why bother with that?" Pip asked once they were on their way. "I do what I please, Pip," Jared replied. "Which is helping fancy bastards out now, is it?" he countered. "You're losing your touch if you thought they looked fancy." "Just a pair of kids Darren paid to walk ahead once nobody was looking," Jared countered. Pip shut up at that. He'd been hired on to something similar once, though not in a dungeon. Jared had been the one dragging him half dead out of the woods afterwards. As much as he didn't like seeing someone waste money, he couldn't argue with that kind of a thing. The walk through the mine was lit well and easy. A couple of old carts were used to bring supplies along until they reached the actual dungeon entrance. An eerie chamber with a high ceiling and stairs leading down. The way the light poured in from above made it easy to miss the alcoves on both sides with colored magic circles carved into the floor. Top 3 floors are rich in materials and low in danger, but it's not totally absent. "Mind your feet and don't randomly drink or eat anything and you'll be fine." "Cord, you said you want to man the cart yet?" Don said. Cord just nodded, stepping forward to start transferring gear from the cart to a waiting hand pull one at the bottom of the stairs. Pip and the rest of the daggers got gathering tools, packs with water and rations, and sacks to put their goods in. Unlike the top level, the next floor had lighting of a kind, though it tended to be weak and occasionally sputter. It was enough work by though. Rather than leave everyone to fend for themselves, more experienced gathers paired off with the new at Don's order. "Name's Malcolm, I'll show you how things are done today. Pay attention and you'll be ready to do it on your own by lunch," Malcolm offered cheerfully. "Right, thanks," Pip managed, almost sounding sincere. He didn't fancy having to work with someone, certain it would affect his cut of things. Despite that, Malcolm was easy enough to get along with and the hours went by at a reasonable pace. By the end of the day he was tired, but not unexpectedly so. The gathered goods would have to be sold before a proper share could be given, but the weights were marked and some advanced pay given for the hours they'd worked. More than enough for Pip to live well until the next scheduled one in 2 weeks' time. "Wonder how far down the Suns make it before turning tail and running," Cord asked no one in particular as they were all headed into the guild hall. Pip was looking forward to dinner and a hot bath and had no interest in the subject. "Those blowhards who stormed the dungeon this morning?" Already dead, Malcolm said. Some of the townies scoffed or laughed at it while they secured pints of whatever they fancied. Really? Pip asked, a little surprised. It wasn't as if he had a high opinion of the Sun's skills. Still, they were better than the daggers and they'd been alright in the higher layers as Dawn had called them. If they don't turn back before they hit the actual combat ones? Yet, dead, someone else offered. Dungeon seems nice and inviting, right up until it's not. Well, fair enough, Pip said, not particularly bothered. He'd gotten his own pint and was sitting down with the rest of the daggers. The kids from earlier were loitering nearby, looking over curiously, and he had a feeling they'd be up 2 members shortly. Fuck 'em. Let's have roast tonight, Jared offered cheerfully. Pip raised his pint, that he could drink to. Chapter 169. Play testing. When the Red Suns arrived in the valley, I'd gotten a hostile entry notice, but not a raid warning. That hadn't started until the next morning when they were properly into the dungeon. The daggers weren't listed among the enemies when they did. They show up as neutral grey tokens on the map. After the 2 younger men ditched them, at Jared's suggestions, the group was down to 5. Still a healthy number if the party was balanced right. They made it past the gathering layers with only minor difficulty. Something which wasn't a good omen for them, as the Bone Brigade had never had trouble with them in the first place. Reiner's party hadn't either. Caution didn't appear to be in the vocabulary as they chugged along through the entry layer. They'd gotten a map at the inn when they arrived. One they'd paid dearly for after pissing off Icarus. A move I'd thoroughly approved of, even though I'd meant for it to be free. They made it to the descent chamber reasonably quickly. That was when they made a rather severe mistake. Rather than taking the stairs down, they walked over to the teleport pads and stepped on the green one. The red one only worked in one direction, straight to the lair, but the others went both ways. The map had a warning about not using them if you hadn't actually tried the layers before. One they apparently gave 0 fucks about. In the viewing room of the necropolis, psychic and actual laughter went up as it happened. I just sighed. Green was the first and easiest of the combat layers, but I was fairly certain this group of asshats would have struggled with the gathering layers. Ugh, this isn't even going to be worth watching, Chris groaned. He'd plopped down on the pillows I'd set up to lounge on early, but hadn't been enjoying himself as much as I expected. Unless you're waiting to collect on a bet, you really don't have to stay, I offered. Chris mulled that over for a moment. I am, but fuck it, he said, getting to his feet. He stretched, bones giving up a hideous crack despite his illusion of life being active, then he was off. I can't blame him for his impatience, Henry offered, with a sigh of his own. Yet, not exactly riveting stuff, I agreed. I had a low-key sense of dread, but it was truly weak compared to what happened with the hero party came through. Not that it had come even close to the terror that I'd felt with the bandits and soldiers the first time. I was always going to feel threatened when someone hostile came, but competence in how well defended I was obviously played a role. The general mood of the viewing area was low for a while, but turned merry as full-blown heckling started. Everyone who felt like it called out the party's various dumb moves. The Suns made it about halfway into the first combat layer before I felt like only an idiot would keep going. They'd taken injuries and only had garbage-grade healing items. Items which they weren't using nearly as often as they should have. I didn't get to find out if their supply was limited or they were just stupid. They made camp in the corridor rather than trying to reach a safe zone. Only the one for the green layer stack was listed, the rest of the dungeon a sketchy hint of deeper depths with no detail. A little taste to lure the curious in rather than a proper play-through guide. What little interest in the group that remained immediately burnt out. The Bone Brigade dispersed to go do whatever else seemed like it would be fun. Henry and I head for the Palace of Shadows. I kept a screen open as we worked on projects, only occasionally glancing over to see how things were going. The sun slept in shifts but eventually seemed to feel recovered enough to keep going. By the time they reached Squish they were in bad shape. To the Bone Brigade the giant centipede was more of a punchline than an obstacle. That didn't hold true for the Suns. He managed to use his ability to call other large centipedes to join the fray and the group was quickly overwhelmed. Full party wipe in less than 8 actual hours of exploration, discounting their time resting. I wasn't one to turn down easy points, and these were offered on a platter. What was a little grating was how quickly the party had wiped. I'd been hoping to get a better idea of how existing tactics worked before more groups showed up. It looked like I'd been overly optimistic. If the Suns were average, I'd be fine, but I wasn't willing to bet on that. Elim had suggested that the local level was pretty low, but also mentioned that wasn't true everywhere. The elemental core he'd found could potentially be sold somewhere, not that he knew where. That place likely had better overall magic. I'm less concerned about your adventures training idea now, Henry offered. He'd been working on an intricate piece of embroidery since he'd lost interest in the raid. Putting it aside, he looked at me with amusement. Yeah, if they're like this it would take a lifetime or two for them to become a threat. Without class changes anyway, I agreed. Though I was interested in getting my hands on a crystal that could do that, I wasn't planning on offering it as a guild service. The world didn't need a bunch of heroic assholes running around. Breaking the church's monopoly would be good, but it needed to be done carefully. It would be better to stick one in my dungeon and only offer it to those who I felt wouldn't abuse a power increase in ways I'd object to. At least if I couldn't set conditions for those who received the service. Figuring out if it could alter NPC classes would also be good. There were better ones than those I'd been seeing. Specializations too that few people had access to. I believe you are scheming, Henry said, chuckling. Ruminating on a possible scheme, I clarified. Making a weaker crystal that could only alter those would be something I'd be comfortable letting pretty much anyone have access to. A purely theoretical option until I actually got my hands on one. Well, best do so quickly. The Lepusen are due to depart soon, Henry reminded me. Ban and a couple of the others were going to take supplies and bring back the rest of the band. Something I was looking forward to as it meant my living population would soon be on the rise. They'd tried to turn down my offer of a cart and some donkeys to pull it, but I'd talked them around. They were strong and certainly faster on foot, but they had a large number of people to care for. Even carrying heavy packs wouldn't do the job. Besides, between the elderly and children, it was likely someone would need to ride rather than walk. Ditching the cart once they found the group and distributed supplies was also an option, though I doubted they'd need to do that. True, I agreed, checking the time. My lack of a real day-night cycle could be a little problematic when it came to dealing with topsiders. It would likely be prudent to have office hours above just so I knew when it was daylight without having to check the system clock. Did you convince him to take a water stone? Henry asked. I managed to talk him into it as a loan. They didn't have an easy time in the desert, and while I hope they can just come over from the post town, better safe than sorry, I explained. It had taken some lengthy debate, but I'd won. Like the supply cart I'd insisted on, they'd been reluctant to accept the item. I could understand why. It probably felt like way too much. Possibly also like a debt they'd have to repay. I wasn't going to do the whole "your treasure is my trash" song and dance like I had done for the girls though. It didn't warrant that level of theatrics when persistence was sufficient. I got up and stretched before taking on my giant's-kin form. The mayor was due to make an appearance and I needed to pick out an outfit. Chapter 170. Departure. Ban wasn't surprised when the mayor turned up. She'd mentioned she might come to see them off. Everyone else though was caught off guard. He'd told them she was giant's kin, but seeing was a whole other matter. She supplied them a map and the water stone she'd insisted on. A grace he had no means of repaying, but didn't further attempt to deny. She clearly wouldn't relent. She'd already talked him into a wagon with a pair of mules to pull it. The only real surprise had been the human man showing up, Elim. Their temporary guide to the post town. He brought his own supplies and a pretty white horse with intelligent eyes. Fair fortunes, Dew offered when they were ready to depart. Thank you, mistress, Ban offered as he and his companions all bowed to her. It was what the townsfolk often called her rather than mayor. I'll try to keep Bess from hunting your chickens, Dew added to Elim. He chuckled. If she catches one, good on her, Elim said with a grin. On that odd note, they departed. Who's Bess? Joss asked, sullying what little solemnity remained. Ban had meant to keep a polite distance from the man. He seemed to be some kind of retainer of the mayor's. Asking personal questions wasn't how you treated such a person. My daughter. She's got a taste for chicken and isn't content to wait on her grandmother to decide to butcher one, Elim explained easily. And you don't mind? Joss asked. Chickens were valuable. Now, we've got some older ones that don't lay. I'm just waiting on her to ask for my help before I teach her to make proper snares. Till then, they aren't in much danger. Not unless one of those rascals in town decides to teach her, Elim explained. He laughed in amusement at the end rather than seeming upset by the prospect. The people from that assessment place are rather odd. If you're not careful, you might end up with a little rogue on your hands, Ewan said, chuckling. He'd taken the tests and gotten a copper tag like most did. Class is a class, Aleem said with a shrug. True enough, you're a fighter? Ban asked. He'd seen Aleem's entry on the guild board but felt it polite to bring it up rather than simply asserting. That the man carried a sword and wore light armor under a good leather coat was reason enough to warrant it even without having seen the board. Yet, might have trained me in the basics and I did some time soldiering for the Earl. Can't say I'm exceptional though, Aleem fished a copper tag out of his shirt with a rueful look. I think that's got more to do with the standard than your skill. They expect a lot of adventurers around here, Ewan offered. They didn't even let me test. Said I wasn't old enough to join, Joss grumbled none too quietly. Du is particular about ages. Her kind don't even drink until they're 21, Aleem explained. There was a very brief but profound pause among Ban and his men at that revelation. One followed by laughter. Gods be good, none of us are old enough then. Ban wheezed. Well, probably be half into our graves before she thinks we're old enough to wed then, Ewan offered once he caught his breath. The jests and laughter kept up until they were all sore. The journey wasn't a difficult one and nothing dangerous appeared to attack, so they made good time. Aleem turned out to be pleasant company throughout, full of stories from his days soldiering as much as working his family farm. The only real delay was one they made by choice, camping outside the post town rather than pressing to reach it by nightfall on the last day. They chose to arrive early in the morning instead. They were fully supplied after all and the idea was more for them to become familiar than actually needing to stop. A choice that proved fortunate quickly. Aleem made a point of checking the message board on the guild's behalf. It was how he spotted a posting placing a bounty on all demi-human beasts as it put it. A posting claiming to be from the Church of Strom. They'd all left the town immediately after it was found and were hiding out in a rock formation outside of it while they discussed the matter. Aleem was silent but his expression remained pensive as he turned over the posting for them to inspect. Ban took in the crude block print caricature of bestial creatures on it and wondered if the artist had ever actually seen a demi-human. They looked like deformed animals, not proper Lauduran. The bounty was also insultingly low at only 10 silver a head. Well, this is shit, Joss offered with a sigh. This isn't the Earl's territory, they can likely do as they please, Ban said. It's not the Earl's territory, but he had the post town built and appointed its mayor, Aleem said. His tone was odd, quiet but cold as he stared at the drawing. What are you going to do about it then? Write him a letter? Joss asked with a scoff. Yeah, later, Aleem said as he folded up the posting. In the meantime, I'll continue on with you lot. What? Ewan asked, caught off guard. Du asked I make sure you and yours can get back safe. I can hardly do that if I leave you now, not with Stromhold moving in the area, Aleem explained. Even if she said that, why go so far? Ban asked. That she asked is enough. I owe her my mother's life and a sight more besides, Aleem replied flatly. That's not a small thing, Ban agreed, surprised. But it means leaving your family, so why? Ewan cut in. He was openly suspicious, which wasn't helpful. Putting someone on guard immediately wasn't a good way to get information. I'm part of the guild but it's not my job. I work for Du, she calls me her knight of errands as a joke because I'm supposed to go out and get things for her. Books, rare herbs, things like that, Aleem explained. So staying with you isn't an inconvenience, though if it's just that you don't trust me to have your back, say so. I can respect that. Ban held up a hand to forestall Joss saying something stupid. He didn't particularly trust Aleem, but there wasn't any real reason not to take him up on the offer. Having a human around if things got complicated might be the difference between life and death. Right then, glad to have you along, Ban said. Joss didn't look happy but didn't disagree either. Ewan accepted with a shrug. Don't imagine your ladies at home are going to be pleased with you, Ewan said with a scoff. It wasn't mean-spirited though and Ban realized he had a point. Aleem wasn't supposed to stay with them so his family would be missing him in a few days. Ah, don't worry about that. I talked it over with them before I left. I was always going to go and look around for things for Du so I wasn't heading right back anyway. My ma isn't too happy with us not repaying her, what with her giving us so much, Aleem explained. If you say so, Ban said with a shrug. It wasn't truly his business in the first place and it was already arranged for. Really, even if it wasn't, that wasn't his problem. Still, he was going to stay clear of the man and his farm when they got back. Ado in a fret could kick down a tree, and he didn't imagine human females were any less formidable, even if they didn't have the same kick strength. Though I will let them know before we get much further on about the change in plans, Elim added, glancing at the sky. Above them a black hawk was circling lazily. Your mate's got a nice talent, but it is soul-shivering to be watched like that, Joss said. Yuan discreetly socked him in the arm for being rude. Tiller really is something, Elim said with a chuckle. But she's not my mate, still courting her. Ban looked at the fondness on Elim's face as he looked up at the abomination hawk above them. It was kind of sweet, if a bit confusing. Lapusan courting was more or less just declaring you fancied each other and moving in together. Or sharing fires while they were on the run. Not that Ban was sure that was how it had always been. He'd have to think about it and maybe ask around once they brought the elders back. Chapter 171. The Trail. Ban lifted his muzzle, drawing in a long breath through his nose. Behind him, the others watched in expectant silence. Still no scent and little trace, but no new trail sign either. They were likely on the right path or would find a message to the contrary soon. They set off again without a word, tracking through sparse greenery after a week of scrublands. Taller trees loomed in the distance, unwelcoming. They provided more shelter against the elements but hid enemies as easily as they did his people. They'd been searching for signs of his people once they made it out of the desert for nearly 6 days. It hadn't been easy going. They hadn't been heading toward the valley exactly, but rather the general direction of the post town and lands beyond. The elders hadn't been convinced by Hetch's story of the valley and its promise of safety. They'd thought it best that the band move to new lands and try their luck there. Still, it allowed them to pivot if Ban's investigation found any truth in the claim. A claim Ban was overdue in reporting on thanks to the Seekers and the chase. He'd taken much more time than he'd thought he'd need to lead them away from the band before heading for the valley. The elders likely thought him and the rest dead. The band would be heading for the post town but was thankfully slow-moving. They wouldn't have made it to the desert's edge yet. Not without abandoning the weak and infirm among them, which they would not do. So Ban kept looking, combing the ground for the scarce traces of their passage and hoping to catch onto a scent to let him know they were nearby, that he was catching up. Ban, we should rest a bit, Yuan urged as midday approached. Ban was reluctant but signaled a halt. Thank the goddess, Joss grumbled as he flopped down dramatically. They'd been tracking for days at a brisk pace, but not so hard as his theatrics suggested. Compared to their desperate flight to the valley, it was downright leisurely. Going to tell me I'm pushing us too hard? Ban grumbled to Yuan. The other man was sitting down placidly to drink from his canteen and have some of the trail bread Duex had sent with them. Fuck no, I want to find them as badly as you, Yuan replied flatly. Ban snorted at that involuntarily, and they both started laughing, though nothing about the situation was amusing. After resting, Ban turned to look at Joss and found Elim offering him a flask. One that Joss was already bolting back before Ban could even think much about it. It wasn't as if it was anything strange. A sip of something might help Joss feel better and complain less. Ban was just appalled by how much and how fast he drank. He could only hope Joss didn't get drunk and whine the rest of the day. Elim caught him looking and nodded, taking his flask back from Joss without comment. The human man had been like that most of the trip. He occasionally offered odds and ends or a drink around the campfire to make things easier, but was quiet otherwise. He'd also taken charge of the supply cart, as no one else knew what to do with it. Ban was thankful for it but a little confused. He'd thought Elim was some minor noble or, at the very least, some rich human. Yet he seemed comfortable living rough and doing chores. After the break, Joss didn't grumble quite so much, and they continued on their way. It was another day before they found a new sign, a change of direction and a warning of enemies nearby. Ban quickened his stride, praying silently all was well. He dreaded what state he might find their people in. Creating a slight swell in the land, he caught a faint trace on the wind and stilled. Ban dropped down on all fours, nose practically in the dirt as he started scenting, hoping it wasn't just a wind-borne phantom or his desperation conjuring wishes. Finally, he found the faint but genuine trail and stopped once more. Yuan joined him quickly, along with Joss. How recent? Joss muttered, crouching down beside him. He was young and hadn't been trained fully yet. He couldn't judge a trail precisely. 2 days, perhaps, Ban said, ears flicking nervously. Despite the lead, Ban and his group were faster, even with a cart. He couldn't help looking about, trying to find the enemy the prior sign had indicated. We'll have to hurry. A storm's brewing, Yuan said, looking skyward. It was empty but dull-colored, and the air was heavy with moisture. If it broke before they found the band, they'd lose the trail and possibly take days to find it again. Ban couldn't stomach that idea, not with the hope of reunion dangling just before him. He looked at Joss and Yuan and found a similar resolve in their expressions. Rather than rest, they forewent sleep, traveling through the night by the moon's light as clouds gathered ominously. It wasn't until they reached the forest edge that they lost its light entirely. They should have stopped and made camp, but Aleem tied up his horse and the mules with the cart and produced a magic stone that shed light like a torch. Without another word, they were off again, closing in on their people as the wind picked up to a howl and midnight approached. It wasn't until they were nearly at the encampment that Ban signaled Aleem to stay back. A human wouldn't be welcomed under the best circumstances, and coming unannounced at night would invite trouble. Aleem stopped, tossing Ban the light stone rather than questioning or protesting the decision. Even with the stone, Ban didn't find the camp so much as find himself in the midst of it, spears at his neck. There was no real transition between the forest and the hideout. Confused but familiar faces squinted at him through the unexpected brightness. Relief so profound it brought tears to his eyes hit Ban all at once. The guards looked terrible, haggard with dull and mangy pelts. Tears streaked down his face as he took them in. They were battered and threadbare but alive, and he'd found them. Chapter 172. Kindred. Aleem stood in the dark, the hood of the cloak he'd pulled out of inventory up. Like everything he asked for on the fly, the quality was too good, but he didn't mind. Nobody would be able to see the fine fabric or two small stitches in the dark and eventually the rain. He'd given the Lepusan a light stone but didn't bother with one for himself. It wasn't perfect, but his mage eyes let him see fairly well in the dark. Enough that he wouldn't be tripping over stones or walking into trees. There wasn't enough natural magic in the area for detail, but it was advantage enough. Rather than take action immediately, he waited a while. The forest smelled like thick loam and a hint of rot in the wet air. The thick growth made it good for hiding or ambushes. He walked away from where he'd been left before reaching out with his mind to call on Marlowe. Marlowe, I don't fancy them being interrupted tonight. I think they've all had enough running for the moment, Aleem said softly. Indeed, came Marlowe's low reply as he stepped out of the dark. He was a bright spot in the dim landscape, the most magical thing for miles. Aleem didn't know exactly how it worked, how much Marlowe could or couldn't hear when he wasn't summoned. He'd made sure he knew what was happening though, keeping him caught up with texts and the occasional whispered conversation when he dared. So long as he was careful it didn't seem like he was doing anything but occasionally muttering to himself despite the Lupsan's frankly terrifying hearing range. Not being particularly deluded about his own abilities, Aleem started walking away from the camp rather than follow the hound. As he did Marlowe circled it, reporting when their paths crossed. The sign indicated an enemy was near, heavy on Aleem's mind. He hadn't seen it himself, Ban reasonably cautious about not letting an outsider learn their signs, but he'd been told it indicated human enemies specifically rather than animals or monsters. Anything yet? Aleem asked softly when Marlowe appeared. Small signs of someone on the trail, but none yet of a larger party, Marlowe reported after an hour. Probably trying to find where they're headed, catch a larger group, Aleem mused. Not a bad plan really, but he remembered what 42 had said about the Seekers using flares to communicate. Or trying to anyway. They hadn't done so well in the maze she set up by all accounts. Perhaps, Marlowe replied. Find the tracker but don't kill them, Aleem decided. As you say, Marlowe said, but hesitated to go. Something wrong? Aleem asked. Does hunting your own kind bother you? Marlowe asked after a moment's hesitation. Aleem was a little surprised but considered the idea for a few moments. Being human doesn't make someone my kind the way it might for others. Man ought to have done something before you turn on him, and even then that's no reason to go after his kin, Aleem explained. Why not kill the tracker then? Marlowe asked. Aleem blinked, confused for a moment before what the problem was sunk in. He couldn't help a huff of laughter, though he tried to muffle it with his hand. I've got a couple questions for him and I want his stuff. We'll kill him after, Aleem explained, giving Marlowe a scritch behind the ears. The hound's tail wagged happily and soon he was off back on the hunt. The question lingered though. As a soldier for the Earl, Aleem had done some things hadn't particularly liked. They'd been in defense of the people or to carry out the law, but that hadn't changed their harsh nature. He hadn't really minded though nor felt compelled to try and change anything. Elim could live with finding out he was wrong, had done the wrong thing, because he understood he'd been doing the best he could with the information he had. It was why he was able to follow the orders he'd been given, because the Earl and the men he chose to serve in his stead were doing the same. To Elim the Earl seemed like a man doing the best he could to be reasonable, as fair was rarely possible. Not when dealing indirectly with such a large group of people. Stronghold seemed the opposite of that. A mad place where a law without rhyme nor reason to it existed. Hate the idea of the place as he did, Elim wouldn't have gone looking for trouble in a foreign kingdom. Trouble was they were getting perilously close to the valley and his family of their own accord. 42 would be more than match enough for anyone who dared, but it still made Elim's hands itch for his sword. He didn't want such people close enough to even see the outer defenses, let alone touch them. "I've found him," Marlowe said, startling Elim out of his thoughts. Only long practice and a couple good beatings as a soldier kept him from making a sound despite that. The hound really made no sound when it didn't want to. "Good, hopefully he'll have made a camp and have his things with him." "I don't care to go climbing trees," Elim replied after a moment. It would be bad luck if the man had elected to string his gear up to keep animals out of it. He made sure to reward Marlowe with some head pats before they set out, Elim trailing after him slowly. The path was easy, the hound making sure of it, but he still had to take care to be quiet. They arrived just as the first light touch of rain began to find a single man in leathers sitting miserably amidst a cold camp. A good setup considering his task, though he spoiled it quickly by lighting a fire once the rain grew heavy. Elim really had to wonder what kind of discipline the Seekers taught if they could be so easily undone by a spot of cold rain. Unsurprisingly, it didn't take the man long to fall asleep either. "Almost seems a waste to tie him up," Elim muttered. He couldn't be sure what the man would know, but he doubted it would be much given how poorly he behaved. Huddled up with Marlowe sheltering under his cloak, Elim was actually a little colder than he'd have been on his own. The stone dog seemed to suck in heat without sharing any. "Then allow me," Marlowe said. Elim didn't have time to question what the hound meant as the other man's body began sinking into the earth. It wasn't a fast process, he could have gotten up if he'd roused and moved quickly, but he didn't. A few minutes later he was buried up to his neck in soft earth. "Remind me not to piss you off," Elim mused. "I find you agreeable, master, and cannot harm you anyway, but will should it be needed," Marlowe replied solemnly. Elim laughed at the serious tone and started giving him a good scratch and belly rub, though it hurt his hands a bit to do it even with good leather gloves on. He'd really need to get some plate ones that covered the tips of his fingers fully at some point. Elim put up a bit of canvas with ropes to block the rain before going through the small tent the other man had been sleeping in. He found a backpack full of gear and started going through it. Very little of it seemed like anything that would interest 42, but he threw anything unfamiliar into his inventory all the same. Intent on his search, Elim didn't bother waking the other man, though he eventually roused on his own. There was some considerable caterwauling, threats, and tears once Bryn Barn, as he called himself, woke up. Elim didn't care for it, but waited it out a bit while the man got comfortable with his helplessness. His only regret was that the other man being entrapped in earth, while effective, made it difficult to hold a conversation without getting a crick in his neck. Once Bryn Barn's general panic subsided, the conversation did not improve. "You and your whole lot of heretics are going to die in agony once my company arrive," Bryn Barn growled. "Right, about that, how many are in the main seeker group?" Elim asked for the third time. He could have been more menacing about it, but was busy reading a little booklet that explained how the flares worked and what the colors were for. Given that the man only seemed to have one kind, red, his having the little manual was likely a mistake. Drop it in the lofting tube wick down and the light wick wasn't complicated. He should have simply been drilled on that. "Hundreds," Bryn Barn spat. "Not much of a liar, are you?" Elim chided. He'd have said 40 in the other man's place. It was a reasonably intimidating number but not absolutely ludicrous. "Heretic," Bryn Barn replied, teeth gnashing. It was his favorite insult despite not having landed any of the other times. "That word doesn't mean what you think it does," Elim said, putting the booklet and flares in his inventory. "Oh?" Bryn Barn challenged. Elim just shook his head and slit the man's neck, careful to get the jugular and made it quick. Marlowe started to bury him fully, but Elim held up a hand to stop him. He'd been useless but there wasn't a point in cruelty, they'd wait until he was properly dead. "What does it mean?" Marlowe inquired as the other man bled. "Means someone of a faith rejecting parts of it or practicing it differently than the church says they should," Elim explained. I can't be a heretic because I don't give two fucks about his faith, nor was I born to it. I can see why you'd reject him as your kind, Marlowe replied. Elim just snorted at that. Bought time to get back to where I'm expected to be waiting, Elim said, brushing his pants off as he stood. Brynbarn was properly dead and he found what he'd been looking for. He didn't plan on hiding what he'd done from Ban, but it was a conversation for later. One he didn't plan on making the other man track him down to have. The Lepusan had enough worries as it was without him adding to them. Chapter 173. Reunion. It took a few hours and a great deal of repeating himself for Ban to get everyone in the camp on the same page. Ewan and Joss might have helped, but they were busy carrying goods from the cart. They'd expected things would be bad, but they'd underestimated how much worse they could get. A tarp was suspended above and a fire lit before the rain started coming down properly. It was a bit of a risk, but they had injured and sick to be tended to. They needed the heat as much as anything, so the light stone wasn't enough. It did prove handy to check over everyone in detail though. Yours is a strange kind of luck, getting chased like that but finding magic rocks, Gretch offered with a wet laugh. As the oldest of the elders she held a position of respect, but her mind was a bit gone, so she didn't often weigh in on decisions. With the wet in her lungs and a turned ankle, it was a small miracle she'd made it as far as she did, and Ban was glad for it. We found more than that, Ban said with a chuckle as he offered her a potion. It was another thing he'd been leery of accepting from Du, but hadn't been able to refuse. He'd accepted 3 for physical injuries and 4 for disease, along with a barrel of a tonic that tasted like cider. The cider was being passed around freely while Ban figured out who needed the most urgent treatment. Thankfully nobody else had been seriously ill. He couldn't have justified prioritizing Gretch otherwise. What might have become a death sentence under other circumstances was now just a minor inconvenience. She could ride in the cart while her ankle mended, along with a few others with similar injuries. Harry dead then? Gretch asked. Her tone was conversational despite Harry being her own grandkit. She'd lost her own children and taken care of the clan's orphans along with a few other elders. She'd seen too much of death for it to strike as hard as it should have. As it would have if it were a rare thing. No, she's just waiting on us to bring you to her, Ban said. Gretch relaxed a bit at that, giving away that she wasn't as calm as she seemed. She's helping plan where we'll live, or she'd have come with us. Well, that's sensible. Bunch of bucks wouldn't know the first thing about digging a proper warren, Gretch said with a laugh. She paused then, looking confused and touching her chest as she took a deep breath. Not just rocks, Gretch said, looking Ban dead in the eyes with a grin as she did. Finished helping Gretch, Ban joined in on hauling the last of the supplies they'd brought. They'd been carrying cargo in the rain as they were the 2 most able bodies available. Even with a tarp and fire, the majority of the band spent the night uncomfortably damp and cold. They weren't hungry though, which made it better. In the morning they seemed almost cheerful. With everything going on, Ban realized he'd forgotten something. He took a moment to take Ewan and Joss aside. Either of you see Elim last night? Ban asked. No, but we weren't looking either, Ewan said. Joss just shrugged. Ban didn't distrust Elim, but was a bit concerned that he might eventually wander over looking for them. He honestly should have taken a moment the prior night to make it clear that he needed to stay put. Joss, go let him know we're all right and to stay where he is, or go to the cart for now, Ban said. Though not the best tracker, Joss would likely be able to find Elim without much trouble. Unless he'd gone wandering already, he'd be nearby, which would make the rain less problematic. Once Joss was on his way, Ban and Ewan got going on preparing breakfast from the provisions they'd brought. A task that others stepped in to help with since they had 50 to feed, and preferably quickly. The last of the tonic was passed around in the meantime. Joss was back by the time the food was done with. The elders gathered, though everyone was sitting as close as they could to hear what had happened. They didn't often carry on council behind closed doors often, and the situation called for even less privacy than usual. So Hecha wasn't wrong? Artem asked. He was the eldest of the bucks among elders, though not nearly so old as Gretch. No, if anything she didn't do the place justice. It's a good valley surrounded by a natural stone maze and on the other side of the coral sands. Not a good place to attack and easy to hold, Ban replied. Enough room for us all? Jala asked. The other does looked to her. It had likely been the most pressing question on their minds. More than enough, and I don't exactly know what some of them are, but the human townsfolk there aren't fully human. The rest aren't even part. There are bouncy little folk with tails called halflings, and others, Ban explained. The elves had been the more diverse group and a little hard to explain. The dwarves would just sound like short humans, so he left off trying to describe them at all. One had to see them to properly appreciate that they were in fact different. Fine, but are they really going to just let us live there? Just invade their town? Celis asked. She was pinched looking and had a pragmatic streak that could make her seem bitter. Ban was rather glad she'd asked so soon. The quicker the serious questions were gotten out of the way, the better. We've been invited. And yes, before you ask, there is a catch, Ban explained. He took out the copies of guild posting he'd brought with him and passed them around. Behind the town itself is an old mine where a dungeon was discovered. Some people fled, others decided to take advantage and are forming a guild to gather resources from it. That's a mad thing to do, Artem said in shock. Perhaps, but I've taken the test they set for those who are interested. I made the lowest ranking, and only because I wasn't outright disqualified. They've attracted people with heroic classes there and they are looking to recruit and train anyone interested, Ban countered. He couldn't say it wasn't mad, but the guild was thorough. They were being as careful and organized as possible in their insanity. We'd have to join the guild then? Go in a dungeon? Artem asked, looking ill. No, because it's not just the adventure guild that needs people. They've got lots of apprenticeships and work to go around thanks to people leaving. The mayor has pledged to help us find opportunities that suit us best. The town needs people, Ban explained. Well, let me know when you're all done dithering about it. You had me as soon as you described a natural fortress guarded by mountains and a desert, Gretch chimed in. Subdued laughter followed that. You've given us a lot to think about, Jala said. That was normally the end of a matter, but Ban was feeling impatient and reached into the collar of his tunic to draw out a pendant on a piece of leather. His copper tag and the blue fighter's stone glittered as he tossed it to Artem. There's one other thing, I've seen the temple to Laurel myself, Ban explained. Yuan and Joss looked at him in surprise. I took Hecha aside when she came and asked after it. Then I went looking for it when I had a moment alone in the valley. I don't know if the townsfolk know of it or not, but it is definitely there, Ban explained. The pendant carried a small likeness of Laurel with her spear, the backside had the World Eater's head on it. He'd found it in a bowl of them near the door as he was leaving. Possibly tokens for the faithful once upon a time. Why the fuck didn't you tell me? Yuan asked, sounding offended. That didn't stop Artem from passing the pendant around. Because if they didn't know about it, I didn't want them to find it because the lot of us were sneaking around to visit it, Ban replied honestly. He trusted Yuan, but it would have been a profound temptation. Also, if Joss had caught us, everyone from there to the sea would have known about it, Ban added. Fair, Yuan replied, mollified. Hey! Joss said in offense. Chapter 174. Friends and Liars. Elim wished for a moment that Tiller had come along. Her recon ability really was second to none and he'd have liked to know where the Seekers were exactly. There were more Lepusen in the camp than he'd thought there would be and they weren't in good shape. Leaning against the cart he stared at the dirt patch he'd been drawing squiggles on and sighed. It didn't look much like the drawing he'd been given. Still, it would do so long as nobody got too close a look at the scroll in his hand. What the fuck is that? Yuan asked. The man moved so quietly that if Elim hadn't gotten a warning from Marlowe he'd have jumped out of his skin. Seriously, Joss added, menace in his tone. He let out a grunt a moment later, probably Yuan or Ban had socked him for trying to be intimidating. Looks magical, Ban offered hesitantly. Since all three were present Elim felt a touch of relief. If Yuan or Ban had turned back before reaching the cart he'd have had to insist they come over to see. Joss was a good kid, but not much of a witness. Mayor gave me a scroll that holds things inside. I'm guessing by the state of the cart that y'all could use some extra food and such, Elim explained. He cut his thumb and smeared blood on the scroll for the sake of appearances. The goods themselves he pulled from his inventory. He'd decided on a second fully laden cart, complete with a set of donkeys to pull it. The three Lepusen men hadn't done terribly well trying to drive the first one, but just leading on foot would work fine too. I don't know what to say, Ban got out after a moment of staring. Yuan was just looking in disbelief between the ground and the cart. Joss wasn't even moving his head, mouth agape and staring. Well, next time I'd suggest less in the way of argument with the mayor when she offers to supply you. I know it seems like a lot, but you can give what you don't use back, Elim started. 42 hadn't told him to say it, but he was aware of the back and forth that had gone on. It was a good moment to break the lot of them of the habit of thinking stuff mattered. At least enough that they wouldn't risk being undersupplied on a rescue mission a second time. It was possible they'd be bringing other of their kin into the valley later on. Getting them in the right mindset to coordinate with 42 would be for the best. Besides, she'd rather y'all get back safe than worry about a few trinkets. She ain't quite like us, magic isn't something she has just a bit of, it's part of her, Elim added. He wasn't even particularly lying on the point, which he hoped assisted with making him seem truthful. We don't have a way to repay her, Yuan said, finally tearing his eyes away from the cart. Living in the valley is good enough. She calls herself the mayor, but I suspect it's a bit more than that. She honestly seems to need people to look after. So just think of it that way, living there lets her rest easier, Elim offered. Like one of the old guardians? Ban asked. The what? Elim asked. The words individually made sense, but he wasn't sure what Ban was referring to. I remember stories about them from when I was a kid. Things like statues that could walk or strange creatures that protected places. Sometimes they were natural places, others great cities and the like, Ban explained. My mother used to say they were appointed to the task by the gods. Oh, well, possibly, Elim replied. He'd heard stories like it, but not enough to think of the creatures in question as a kind of class of their own. Nobody had said they were set by the gods either. Though that wasn't all that strange, Ban was from a different kingdom and of a different species. Folks always had their own stories to pass around. No idea about the gods part though, he added honestly. He supposed 42 might have been appointed to her dungeon by an evil god or something similar, but wasn't sure. Or rather a god of chaos, though he doubted anyone would find the distinction particularly comforting. Thank you for this Elim, and please let the mayor know my people will be coming, albeit slowly, Ban said solemnly. You don't want me to ride with you, Elim said flatly. He wasn't offended and hadn't planned to anyway, but curious about the reason. My people don't trust humans and I'm worried they won't treat you fairly just now, Ban replied bluntly. All right, Elim said with a nod. I'll send her a letter. A letter? Aren't you heading back? Ban asked. No, I still have some business to attend to. I'll be back before you know it though, Elim offered with a bit of a grin along with his hand. Ban and Yuan accepted it in turn, clasping at the wrist for a shake before letting go. Right. I'm not getting within a mile of your dough, Joss said. He refused to shake until Ban gave him a push in Elim's direction. A fond mixture of amusement and annoyance overtook Elim and he pulled the boy into a headlock. Keep yourself alive, brat, Elim offered. After tickling Joss's ribs for a moment he let go and dodged a kick. Bastard. Joss said, but he looked sadder than angry. They'd gotten along well and goodbyes probably felt more final to him than they should. I'll be getting on my way, safe travels, Elim offered as a final parting. Heading to his horse he was quickly mounted and on his way, setting a sedate pace though he didn't intend to ride for too long. Marlowe came loping alongside once they were far enough away that there was no risk of him being seen. He looked quite pleased with himself and Elim couldn't help a grin. It went well, I take it, Elim asked. Very, the white-cloaked humans are rather stupid. They didn't listen to their dogs and are chasing the tracks I made, Marlowe replied, woofing like happy laughter. Good job, Elim said. Marlowe's tail rose up and wagged at that. The Seekers were headed off course if they followed the trail and didn't double back. Even if they did, Marlowe had erased the Lepusans' tracks for a good distance and done something that would make the dogs refuse to draw near to them. Elim didn't know what, but had the rather amusing idea he'd just marked his territory like any beast and they'd recognize him as the stronger creature. Elim cut into the forest, taking things slow still for the sake of his horse. They weren't in any kind of hurry and though a potion could mend it, he didn't care for the idea of causing it injury. It wouldn't be any less stupid or cruel even if the damage could be healed easily. Do you think they'll go high or low? Elim asked conversationally as Marlowe kept pace. I hope they go low, but I've no idea which they'll choose, Marlowe replied after a few moments. Fair, Elim replied. Once they got close to the cliff he dismounted and put the horse in his inventory. He spared a moment to look back and whistle in admiration at the total lack of a trail behind them. Marlowe really could make it impossible to track something when he put his mind to it. Elim gave the hound a scratch and then they both started descending using an easy trail. Elim donned the dead seeker's cloak he'd stolen as he did. Marlowe had drawn the main group off the Lepusans' tracks, but there was no guarantee they wouldn't find the trail again later. It was better to deal with the lot of them sooner rather than later. Finding a hard bit of earth, Aleem set up the signal flare and waited a half-hour before lighting it. If he were lucky, the seekers would find the cliff and come down. Marlowe would be able to bring the cliff down on them and kill them easily in that case. If they hesitated on the ridge, though collapsing, it would have a less predictable outcome. Aleem took the gauntlet he'd requested of 42 and sat down to give Marlowe a good scritching like he'd been meaning to. He really was a good boy and deserved to be recognized as such while they waited.